I wonder why was the letter written and why was it kept? Those questions intrigue me now at this part in our study, and we have a study going on in these epistles, but this is a very short letter, and you wonder why is John writing this letter? It's very personal. It's actually to an individual, but in that I've wondered, well, and why did the church keep it? Because that's why we have the word, is what was kept, and they kind of treasured this. So it's one of the beliefs is that these are the last writings. John's letters are the last writings. So it would have been the end of the first century, so 95 to 100. But I had titled this lesson, Faithful Fellowship, and what I wanted to do, and again, I'm taking a break from our Return of the King series, but I wanted to kind of bring this out today. We got a couple of weeks away from this workshop that I'm very excited for because of this fellowship. What I wanted to say here, as far as this faithful fellowship that comes out of this letter that John writes to encourage Gaius in really adverse circumstances. And so if you go back to John's first letter, it's tied to, because all these letters hinge on this thesis statement that John gives in 1 John 1 through 4. If you want to just turn back, because we're in 3 John, so just turn back a few pages and look at John, 1 John, first chapter, first 4 verses. And if you have a heading in there, you have a heading something like the Word of Life. And I'm going to say this at the outset so you see if you perceive this. John, who wrote the Gospel of John, he's considered the apostle of love. This was one of the sons of thunder who transformed and became this apostle of love. It is, just so you know, kind of from the background, it is believed that Gaius is a very close friend, fellow elder with John, but maybe the one that wrote the gospel for John. As John, a lot of times the apostles would speak and somebody would write it down, and it's believed that Gaius was the one that actually penned John's gospel for him. So they have a very close relationship. And John's thesis in these letters is fellowship with God through Jesus Christ equals eternal life. You cannot have eternal life without fellowship with God, with the Creator. Cannot happen. That's his thesis. So let me just read it, because this is how he frames this. 1 John 1 through 4, he says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life, the life was made manifest, and we have seen it and testified to it and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. And we are writing these things so that our joy may be complete. So now I say it's the thesis because he develops this through this letter. This series of letters too is precipitated by heresies that were just more prevalent. They're not new, as we were talking about in our studies during the week. They're not new, but I mentioned when Paul writes to the Romans and he's trying to correct this disunity that Q mentioned this morning, that we have to have this unity in our fellowship. And Paul's concerned when he writes to the Romans that they're running the risk of breaking this fellowship over this Jew and Gentile thing. And he says, you can't have that. But the heresy was already there. But I mentioned when Paul writes to his audience, he's writing at a time where most of the people that he's writing to saw Jesus firsthand. They knew him, witnessed his resurrection. They weren't debating what the resurrection meant. They accepted it. He was the Son of God. There's no disputing that. But toward the end, that was in the, Jesus resurrected in the 30s. John's writing 95 to 100. So we have 2 more generations that have come up. And so now you have people that hadn't seen Jesus resurrected physically. And they want to impose their ideas of what you must have thought you saw. And so they were called Gnostics. How did they gain kind of prevalence in their groups? They had set themselves up as knowing ones. Let me explain to you he didn't really resurrect because he was God. He never really died. John says, no, he came in the flesh. He was a man. And then they said, well, he was a man, but then God came in and swooned him. Janice is not here this morning, but we had this conversation earlier in the week that, John says, no. You can't have that. You have to accept that Jesus was the Emmanuel that we just sang, God in the flesh. God is with us, the foretold one. It's not easy to understand. Paul writes to Timothy and says, this is a great mystery, how God did this. And we could get caught in endless debates over it, but John says, these are heresies. You want eternal life, you have to have fellowship with God. He goes on to say that you cannot walk in darkness and say you have fellowship with the light. And he makes these contrasts because one of the Gnostic beliefs was that what you do in the flesh doesn't matter because flesh is evil, and we now have a spiritual life so that we live this spirit life, and anything we do in our physical life doesn't count for anything, so you could do whatever you want. So they were saying you could go to these pagan orgies or do whatever you want and say, come on guys, take our fellowship and let's go down the street and partake in this because it doesn't matter what we do in the flesh. Both Paul, right, he said, oh my goodness, they say, well, Paul, should we sin all the more that grace may abound? Forbid it. May it never be. We were rescued from this. How could you go back and live in it? So that's the backdrop to this. He's dealing with this all the way through. So this faithful fellowship that I wanted to bring out today, the question I have is, why is hospitality a Christian grace? Okay? Why is hospitality? And I bring this up because we're going to host this workshop at the end of the month, and it's a beautiful time of fellowship. And by the way, if some of you are kind of on the fence, if you want to go, I'm going to plug it throughout the lesson today. But Speedy's being recognized, retiring down in Sunset today, and him and Nancy are going to be here. So I know they said last time they were here was their last time. This time they say this time really for sure. But it's just always a joy when they come up. It's getting harder and harder for them to travel, so we love having them. But because the workshop is at the end of the month, it should be really nice weather. We're expecting a very large group here, which is always exciting. I told you guys they had over 280 at the Inspire workshop just a few weeks ago. So there's a lot of energy and excitement in the air. So we'll get back to that. But the question is, why is hospitality a Christian grace? Well, for one, like I said, because of John's thesis, If you don't have fellowship with Jesus through the apostles' teaching and have this unity, you don't have eternal life. Because the world, as Q just, kind of reiterated again this morning in that reading, the world will take you away. I mean, friendship of the world is enmity, right? It's something that will constantly distract us. And so fellowship is a time where we can come together and be reminded. I say we gather around the table the first day of the week. How well does our Father know us to know that we need this? Can you imagine? It sometimes seems so long ago that we were just here at the table because there's so much that goes on in our lives after we leave here. But here's a personal letter to Gaius, and he's going to write this letter to Gaius, and like I said, my question is, why did the church keep this letter? Well, one of the things that we're going to see in this letter is that it's a missional letter. There are a couple of things that kind of emerge out of this at the end of the first century, when the church now, it's the close of the apostolic age. In the early 100s, the apostles, no more apostles, no more authority from apostolic authority to correct error when it rises. So there are a couple of things that happen, and they never went away. These debates are ongoing even to this day. One of them, we're going to be introduced to Diotrephes, who seems to be one of the elders at the church here where Gaius is, and there's a disagreement about what churches, or congregations I should say, should be doing to take part in other work that's going on. That's why I say it's a missional letter. That debate, that has caused a lot of rifts in congregations. Should we or shouldn't we engage in partnering with others to do missional work? And then the other one, and you kind of read through the early writings of the church and the church fathers, they attribute a lot of this Diotrephes to this rift in the church where they started developing the idea of bishops, a chief elder that was over everybody else. And that kind of, evolved, and that's why we have a lot of religious organizations that rally around a single person. So anyway, the letter starts out, 3 John, it's to the elder, the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. So this is John's close companion. But he says in verse 2, Beloved, I pray that all may go well with you and that you may be in good health as it goes well with your soul. There's one of the commentators, he used this expression. He said, and this is F.B. Beyer, he said, from that verse, he said, it would not be desirable to express the wish of verse 2 to all our friends, because if their bodies were to correspond to the condition of their souls, they would suddenly fall into ill health. A lot of times, and Paul would say, you need to take care of your body, and that's but you've got to work on your spiritual life. And so he kind of turns this around. So Gaius is one that he's got a great spiritual life, but it seems his body is, failing. And so John's, trying to encourage him that way. I thought that was interesting. But this letter, we had gone through this before, and I said, I marvel at this letter because John writes this personal letter of encouragement under really adverse conditions. So verse 4, he says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. He doesn't in all these letters, he doesn't identify what is going on. It's something that you have to infer from his tone. But he says, starting in our text, verse 5 through 8, and here's our points, Linda, for you. So we get and they're going to be all S's today. We're going to see supply, send, share, and support. And that's going to come from each of the 4 verses, those 4 S's. So the first one is supply. He says, "Beloved, it is a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are." So he says, take them in. So apparently, by the way, and again, this is just, getting probably too much information. But it's quite evident that both Paul and John, it's probably true with the other apostles as well, but both Paul and John were very active and known for having these schools of preaching. The school, 2 years at the school of Tyrannus that we read about in Acts. But Gaius may have been a product of John's schooling in that. And what they would do is they would train up these evangelists, and then they would go out and encourage these congregations today we call these itinerant preachers, right? They go from place to place and they encourage folks, but they're not, they probably have a home base, but they're encouraged. Like Jerry Tallman, right? He had a great congregation back in Michigan, but then he had such a great message that people wanted to hear it, so he spent the later part of his life just traveling around and encouraging congregations. But Gaius is one of these that now he's kind of an elder in this place, and he is supplying what these travelers need. And then, so he says, in verse 6, he says, so John is hearing back from them, so apparently, they correspond together, and John says, who testify to your love before the church, you will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God. So then you see, send them on their way, so take them in, help supply them what they need when they're there, and then send them on their way in a manner worthy of God. And then, so number 7 is this sharing idea. He says, for they have gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. So again, they're traveling in what would be, especially at the end of the first century, they're hostile territory, right? If you're traveling as an evangelist, and it's kind of opposed to both what the Jews and the Romans, they don't want to hear from this. So they're saying they're traveling and they're reaching out to people. It's not like traveling today, right? We take it so for granted that we could just go wherever you want and just jump in our car and it takes us a few minutes. You travel by foot, it takes a long time to get anywhere, and you need stops along the way. So, but what a blessing to refresh those that are coming to refresh you and send them on their way so they can be encouraged, because there are people that, like Paul, gave up everything to go out and accept this ministry. It's not an easy life, not one that all of us even have any desire to partake in. But look what he says in verse 8. Therefore, we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers with the truth. This is how we advance and help the body grow together, by us encouraging them when they come. We have an opportunity, like I said, to be hospitable, to host people in their travels and to get this word out. And also, I'm very excited. This might be the first time we're going to have the whole board and all our students, both graduates and present, all together in the same place. Hopefully no snow, Q. Hopefully the weather will be just fine. But it's our way to accomplish the work of the body. But look at this. Verse 9. John, that's why I say it's an encouraging letter, but look at the adversity. Verse 9, I have written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. That's why I said earlier, this apostolic authority while there's still apostles around to settle disputes, they kind of people respect their authority, but where's this mantle of leadership going to rest after they're gone? That's why they write this stuff down. But he says Diotrephes, he's someone who's setting himself up. He likes to put himself first. He doesn't acknowledge our authority. So verse 10, so if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us. And not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers and also stops those who want to and puts them out of the church. And this is why I say this has never really gone away. People, good-mannered, good-intentioned people have very strong views and disagree on what we should be doing. And Diotrephes is one that says, no, we're not going to support them. and Gaius says, well, I'm going to anyway. And John's writing in this letter and he's saying, I'm encouraging you to do that. And when I come, I'll deal with this. But so he says in verse 11, beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Whoever does good is from God, and whoever does evil has not seen God. And then he mentions Demetrius, and he says, Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from truth itself. We also add our testimony, and you know that our testimony is true. So, and he says, I got more to say, but I'd rather not write it down. I want to see you face to face. So this is very personal. But we're given this grace. In fact, John is probably reminding Gaius of what he helped him probably pen in his gospel. John's gospel in chapter 1, where it kind of was the foreground to what I just read in 1 John 1 through 4, this thesis statement. It comes from John 1:14 through 16. When John wrote this, he says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. He said, John bore witness about him and cried out, this was one of whom I said, he comes after me. He who comes after me ranks before me because he was before me. But listen to this. John 1:16. For from his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. And he's saying extend this grace. Welcome the body. Treat them good. So it was supply what they need. That refreshes them. Send them in a manner worthy. Share. This is how we share in the work of the body. And we ought to continue to support this. So hospitality, our question is, so why is hospitality a Christian grace? Well, hospitality connects us with God's people. Q, he says, we have all these studies going on. Get in where you fit in. But listen, I'm not saying that you have to come to the workshop. I'm saying there's a lot of stuff going on now where we're going to be inviting neighbors and things like that. Look for opportunities to be hospitable. Paul says, look to the needs of others. Seek those things. Because this leads to ministry opportunities. So I'm going to talk to you one afterwards, but about, we have some young people that are interested, and I want to talk to you. Maybe we can get something going on a Sunday evening, but we have a young couple here, a young couple, right, Irene, with a young baby. So sometimes we get to know people and the needs, and this is where ministries come from, where you might take care, babysit their kids so they could go out and have date night and things like that. But we learn this when we fellowship together. And so that's where grace abounds. In this time of, where do I fit in? My challenge is this week going forward is to kind of think in those terms. As Q said this morning, we have everybody that we need for the workshop. I'm not saying we don't need you or we don't want you here. What I'm saying is, because of our schedules and everything else, seek out times where you can join an activity or a group or whatever and look for these ministry opportunities. This encourages us and can inspire and even provoke us to more and more ministries, which is what the church is about, meeting the needs of the community around us, and letting people know the reason for the hope that's in us. The people really looking for fellowship and answers nowadays, and we have some great opportunities coming up, so really want to encourage us there. Again, we have this wonderful, we call this invitation song. I think it's is this one? All things are ready. So if you're ready and you have a need, come up while we sing the invitation song.